Hey everybody, this is Deb with Truthification Chronicles, and I actually recorded this way back in October when the caravan was really big news and everything, and before the midterms, but then it was kind of dated, so I'm redoing it because I think this is going to come into play very soon. So let's look at this. This is the Posse Comitatus Act. Okay, now I know a lot of you who are older, like in your 50s and 60s and above, you grew up watching a lot of westerns, and I'm sure you heard the word posse a lot, right? You had the posses going out to get these bad hombres, and we grew up seeing that all the time. Well, this is based on that because this was a law that was signed on June 18th, 1878, so a long time ago, and it did have to do with the posses like that, and that is what it's talking about, the Posse Comitatus. Now, the Comitatus, don't let that throw you, but the posse basically is something that started out like in the olden days over in Europe, like centuries ago. They had the hue and cry. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but when somebody did something wrong and they needed to find them, they called up a hue and cry. The person who owned the land, the lord who owned the land, would call up a hue and cry, and then everybody had to go out and try to find this person. A posse in the old westerns was the same thing. Somebody did something bad, they went out to find them. Okay? Well, the Posse Comitatus Act actually limits what the federal government can do in regards to using the military to deal with domestic policies. As always, I'm going to put the links down below. Now, I am going to read an article about this, but I wanted to give you a heads up. If you're one of those people that don't like to have something read to you, then you can just check down below and find the link there and you can go read it yourself. Okay? I'm just going to read through it and I'm going to put in my 2 cents worth as I go through. Because, like I said, this may come into play in the near future. So, I started out with this. This is a Defense Technical Information Center, and it has a lot of different reports and things here. But this particular one is a report that includes an article on the Understanding the Posse Comitatus Act and the Insurrection Act. And this is by John R. Brinkenhoff, Colonel, USA Retired. So, we're going to read through this. Like I said, it is kind of long, but he tries to explain it very much. So again, if you're one of those people that just likes to get to the heart of everything, then you can go ahead and read it on your own. The links are down below. If you can't find the description, try looking for a little arrow of some kind that you can click on, and that should open it up with the description there, and the links will be there for you. Okay, so we're going to go through this and see what it has to say. I mean, it starts out this documentation page, and this is where it was from, the State Defense Force Journal, Volume 4, Issue 1, Fall 2008. Now, this is from 2008. There have been a couple of slight changes to it. Obama included one change that had to do with the Taliban, but this is primarily what the act says, and it does give a clarification on it and explains it a little bit better for those of us who aren't real great at always reading all those legal terms. So anyway, no, it's not 34 pages long. I'm not reading that much. And this page was left intentionally blank, just so you know. That always gets me when I see that. I understand, but it's just kind of strikes me as funny. Anyway, Understanding the Posse Comitatus Act and the Insurrection Act. Most Americans believe that the Posse Comitatus Act prohibits the use of federal troops to enforce the law in the United States. They also believe that the president has to wait until a governor asks for help before he can send federal troops to help, and even only to quell an insurrection. These beliefs are erroneous. They are based on complete misunderstanding of the two major laws that pertain to this issue. This is important, for understanding the true status of the laws and authorities is essential if we are to provide for the security of the homeland in an age of terrorism and catastrophic natural disasters. Now, the reason that I'm bringing this up now is because in the presser yesterday in the Rose Garden, Trump said that he could bring in the military and have them build the wall. Yes, he can, And we're going to find out. This article right here is a great support for it. It basically says, yes, he really can do this. So let's go on. In this article, I will address both the Posse Comitatus Act and the Insurrection Act using different approaches to help you understand what each really means. I will parse the Posse Comitatus Act to allow you to understand what it really means. Now, he is a little repetitious here, but I will tell the story of the Insurrection Act to allow you to understand how it came to be enacted. This is important, for the true status of the laws and authorities are essential if we are to provide for the security of the homeland in an age of terrorism and catastrophic natural disasters. A lot of people are talking about the Posse Comitatus Act. Now, they were back in October when I did the original, but they're probably going to start saying it a lot more now that Trump has that on record, where he was talking about using the military to build the wall on the southern border. Now, this is not something new. If you've been following POTUS, you understand that he said this several times. I don't know why all of a sudden it's like, oh, he said he could do that. Yes, he's been saying it all along. Hello, pay attention. Oh, so a lot of people are talking about it, and almost all of them get it wrong. And that's still happening today. It was true back in 2008. It's happening now. Few, if any, of the media and academia pontificators have even read the law itself. Well, here it is. United States Code Title 18, Section 1385. Whoever, except in cases and under circumstances expressly authorized by the Constitution or Act of Congress, willfully uses any part of the Army or the Air Forces as a posse comitatus or otherwise to execute the laws shall be fined under this title or imprisoned not more than 2 years or both. Okay, that's what it actually says. Now, if you understand that and everything, you probably have all the meat that I'm going to pretty much tell you in this video. But if that sounds like legal speak to you and a little confusing, like it did me the first time I read it, here we go. He's going to tell us about it. In order to help the readers understand what this one-sentence law means, I'm going to parse it. That is, I'm going to examine its meaning by determining the parts of speech in the sentence. As older readers will remember, this is known as diagramming a sentence. It should be noted at the outset that the law does not contain the word prohibited. The law says nothing about the provision of relief or support from or by the federal government. It pertains to the use of the Army or Air Force to execute the laws as a member of a posse comitatus formed by a U.S. attorney, U.S. marshal, a sheriff, law enforcement officer, or other public official or private citizen. A sentence has to contain a subject, verb, and an object. Okay, not always, but we'll let him go on that, okay? The subject in this sentence is the word whoever. The verb is uses. The object is part of the Army and Air Force. The rest of the sentence consists of clauses that modify the subject, the verb, or the object. Stripped of the modifiers, the sentence reads, whoever uses part of the Army and Air Force. Next, we will address the modifiers of the verb. The first modifier is the adverb willfully. This means that the using is done on purpose and not accidentally. The second modifier explains the kind of use to which the verb applies. In this law, this use is as a posse comitatus or otherwise to execute the laws. The sentence now reads, whoever willfully uses any part of the Army and Air Force as a posse comitatus or otherwise to execute the laws. Note that the offender under this law would not be the Army or Air Force, or members of the Army or Air Force, but the person who uses them in violation of the law. This may explain why no person has ever been convicted of violating the Posse Comitatus Act since it was enacted in 1878. I know you are waiting eagerly to find out what happens to those whoever's that do this bad thing willfully. So we next add the consequences of such an action, and now the law reads as follows. Whoever willfully uses any part of the Army or the Air Force as a posse comitatus or otherwise to execute the laws shall be fined under this title or imprisoned not more than 2 years or both. This is almost the complete law. If it were the complete law, the pontificators would be correct in asserting that the law prohibits the use of the Army and Air Force from enforcing the law in the United States. However, Congress included an important qualification in the sentence that is often overlooked by those who prefer an absolute prohibition. The important exception is the following clause that modifies the subject. Except in cases and under circumstances expressly authorized by the Constitution or Act of Congress. It is clear that Congress has someone in mind that could lawfully authorize the Army and Air Force to execute the laws. Who is this person or persons to whom Congress grants that authority? Congress has on several occasions enacted laws that authorize one person and one person only to authorize the Army and Air Force to execute the laws. That person is the President of the United States. To make it clear what the sentence really says, I will substitute this meaning of the exception clause in the parsed version of the Posse Comitatus Act. Whoever, except the Congress or the President of the United States, willfully uses any part of the Army or the Air Force as a posse comitatus or otherwise to execute the laws shall be fined under this title or imprisoned or both. Restated even more clearly, the intent of this law reads as follows. Only the Congress or the President of the United States may authorize the use of the Army and Air Force to execute the laws. That is what the Posse Comitatus Act means, or at least what it meant when it was enacted in 1878. Unfortunately for the nation, the meaning of the law was completely revised by activist judges in the 1970s, so recent case law is the opposite of the law itself. That modern revised version of the Posse Comitatus Act is what most people are citing when they assert that federal troops are prohibited from enforcing the law in the United States. Fortunately, the Insurrection Act stands, and it permits the president to use federal troops to enforce the laws either at the request of a governor or on the initiative of the president. The Insurrection Act consists of 4 statutes enacted at different times for different reasons that, when considered as a whole, provide the power that presidents have used many times as the legal basis for using troops to enforce the law. The 4 sections of law are as follows. Title 10, Section 334, was enacted in 1792 as the Calling Forth Act to give President George Washington authority to call forth the militia when in his judgment they were needed to repel invasions, suppress insurrections, or enforce the laws. To assure that this authority was not abused, a reluctant Congress specified that before using the troops, the president would have to issue a proclamation calling on the insurgents to disperse in a limited time. Title 10, Section 331 is a combination of 2 laws. One was enacted in 1795 to correct weaknesses in the Calling Forth Act of 1792, when it was used to suppress the Whiskey Rebellion in 1793. This law gave the president specific authority to call forth the militia upon the request of a governor or state legislature if the governor were unable to apply for the assistance. The second law was enacted in 1807 at the request of President Thomas Jefferson to extend presidential authority to call forth the standing army as well as the militia. This section allows the president to use the armed forces to enforce the laws or suppress a rebellion whenever, in his opinion, unlawful obstructions, combinations, or assemblages or rebellion against the authority of the United States make it impractical to enforce the laws using the course of judicial proceedings. Title 10, Section 332, was enacted in 1861 at the request of President Abraham Lincoln to increase presidential authority to use the militia and the regular army to suppress insurrections and enforce the laws. This law was the legal basis for waging the Civil War. This law allows the president to use federal troops on his own initiative and act on his own judgment without waiting for a request from a governor. Title 10, Section 333 was enacted in 1869 at the request of President U.S. Grant to empower him to use federal troops to suppress the Ku Klux Klan during Reconstruction. The original version of this law said that it was the duty of the president to use the armed forces or militia to respond to insurrection, domestic violence, unlawful combination, or conspiracies that deprive any portion or class of people their constitutional rights and privileges when state authorities are unable or refuse to protect such people. The Insurrection Act empowers the president, either upon his own initiative or at the request of a governor, to use federal troops to address a variety of civil disturbances that could be provoked by a major terrorist attack. Sections 332 and 333 make it clear that it is up to the president to determine when and where to use federal troops to enforce the laws. The prudent reader should see for him or herself by going to the internet and reading the statutes cited. The truth of the matter is that the Posse Comitatus Act is irrelevant. It need not be changed. What needs to be changed is the prevalent misconception of its original intent. As the parsing exercise above shows, it was intended to allow the president, and only the president, to use federal troops to execute the laws. As the discussion of the Insurrection Act shows, the president has sufficient authority to do what needs to be done to use federal troops to maintain law and order. The people, the politicians, and the president all need to understand that. And that's the end of the article there. Now, when it comes to this Posse Comitatus, as I said, it's something that's going to be coming up in the near future, I'm sure, because they're going to be talking about what Trump can do and what he can't do. Well, this is going to be part of it. So if Antifa raises its ugly head, then this would be something that could be enacted if necessary. But it also draws attention to what the president's actual responsibility is and what powers the Constitution itself has granted to him. So let's take a look at the Constitution itself and see what powers it gives the president. So, what can the president do? Well, if you go to the Constitution of the United States, and you can find copies of this everywhere, I'll put the link to this one down below, there are so many things that are listed here, but yet it's really not very much. I got a little bit of flack on my previous video about giving some thought to what will happen after the arrests, and if we have a lot of vacancies, how will our government go on? I was not saying that we need to get rid of the Constitution. I was saying that the Constitution itself is a very short document, actually, and it leaves a lot of loopholes, a lot of gaps in between what it says. I know what it says, but there are a lot of things it doesn't say, and those are the things that over the years laws have been made up about. And because of that, we have a lot of laws that are not necessarily against the Constitution, but they're filling in gaps. And when it comes to what the president can and cannot do, there's actually very little that it says that he can do. And if you go down here, it's in Section 2, actually, because the Section 1, all of this, is on Congress, the legislative branch, and then Article 2 is on the executive. And if you look, basically, it just says that the executive power will be vested in him, and his term of office will be 4 years with the vice president. The second one, actually, several of these talk about how the electoral college will be put together, and 2, 3, and 4 will be that. 5 talks about the natural born citizen qualification that he has to have, and he has to be at least 35 years old and been a resident of the United States for 14 years. And then number 6 talks about in case of death or resignation or inability to discharge the duties. And then 7 says the president shall receive for his services a compensation. And for those who don't know, President Trump only takes $1, and he wasn't even going to take that, but they forced him to take $1 each quarter. So like he's made $4 in 2017 and $4 in 2018. So he's made $8 from being president, and he's lost millions, I'm sure, from his businesses. But he chose to do this because he knew it had to be done, and he knew he can make the United States better. And I think he sure has. I don't know about the rest of you, but wow, he's done so much, and our country is definitely bouncing back. People in the world have more respect for us and everything. So it has that. And then it goes on down, and he has to take an oath of office. Section 2 says he'll be commander-in-chief, and it really does not specify what all that entails. So that's why the Posse Comitatus Act and the Insurrection Act came up, because they needed to have a little more defined idea of what the president could do with the armed forces domestically. There's not a lot of question about how he can deploy forces outside the United States, but it was the domestic part that needed more explanation. And so basically it just says, hey, he's the commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy of the United States and of the militia of the several states when called into the actual service of the United States. So that's what he can do. It really does not limit him. I'm sure that there's going to be a lot who are going to say, hey, you know what? The president can't send the troops to the border and can't have them build the wall, but yet he can deploy troops, and it does uphold, as we saw in that last article, that yes, he can deploy troops in the United States to do things to enforce laws. And if there is a problem with the border, he sent troops there. And that was perfectly legal. Obama did it too, but people don't talk about that. But yeah, it was perfectly legal for him to do that. And because the border wall is a national security issue, he has every authority to task the military with building that. And we have the Army Corps of Engineers who can do that. That's what they do. They build stuff. They build walls. They build bridges. They build things. That's what the Army Corps of Engineers does. So to have them work on the wall, perfectly within the president's jurisdiction to be able to do that. So don't be surprised if that's the route they have to go. I think from the start, Trump knew he could do this, but he wanted to get it to go through Congress. And I think right now, he's allowing these Democrats to show just who they are, because the American people are starting to see that they don't have the American people's best at heart. They don't care about us. They don't care about our security. All they want to do is to make sure Trump doesn't get a win. Really, seriously, that's what it comes down to. And this whole idea that the wall is immoral? Seriously, Nancy? How can an inanimate object be immoral? It can't be. Morality is something that has to be with human beings. A wall is amoral. It's not moral and it's not immoral. It's how it's used. And if it's being used to stop human trafficking and to stop drugs from coming in and killing 70 to 80,000 people a year, if it's used to stop weapons, terrorists, and anybody else who wants to do harm to the United States, why is that a bad thing? It's not. We've all heard the clips with them saying that it was fine, that you had to do this, that this was a necessary part to secure our southern border. And now all of a sudden, no, we don't want it just because of Trump. And this kind of thing is dangerous to the United States, because when we have congressmen who are putting their own hatred for our president before what's best for the country, this is danger. But this is not unusual. Those of you who have been following a lot of the corruption things that have been coming out, you understand that these people are more interested in their pockets than they are interested in the American people. They don't care about us. American people are only to be used to gain money and power. That's the only reason they tolerate us. That's why when they talk about us in such derisive terms. They don't care about us as people. They only put on a show for those who are their supporters, so they will think that they care about him. When push comes to shove, they don't care. If Nancy Pelosi truly cared about poor people, if she truly cared about people who are illegal in the country and who need help, humanitarian help, then she would look outside that wall of hers around her mansion and she would see the people literally living in tents out in front of her house. I mean, serious. If you've seen pictures of it, this is the situation they have. They are living in tent cities outside on the street outside of her house. But she's behind that wall, so she's all protected and she doesn't even think about it. She has no clue how common people live. And she doesn't really understand what struggles we go through. This is really what we're dealing with when it comes to the Democrats. We're dealing with people who are out of touch with the real people, the people who are struggling. And then when it suits their needs, then they jump on the bandwagon and say, oh, but these poor government employees who aren't going to get a paycheck, what are they supposed to do? You know, Nancy and Chuck, if you really want to make a difference, all you have to do is say, sure, we'll give you the $5 billion because we don't want to see you suffer. That would make you rise in the esteem of American people. But they won't do that. You just watch. They won't. They're going to make an issue of this to the point where Trump is going to have to take his fallback, which is task the military, the Army Corps of Engineers, to build the wall. The wall will be built. Okay, make no mistake about that. It will be built. How it's done, that's going to be what comes up. And I assume that if he does it that way, yes, they're going to challenge him in court. But as you can see, there's nothing in the actual Constitution that prohibits him from doing that. Nothing at all. And then you saw what this guy said about the Posse Comitatus Act and the Insurrection Act. So I don't see that they will have any legal standing. But then again, I'm not a lawyer. I don't know the law that well, but it doesn't appear to me that there's going to be anything that they can do to stop him from building the wall. Of course, obviously, if it goes to the Ninth Circuit Court, it probably will go that way. They probably will rule against it. But when it hits the Supreme Court, I don't see that they have any case. I could be wrong on that. I don't know. Like I said, I'm not a lawyer, but I really don't see from the Constitution, there's obviously nothing that would prevent him from doing this. And from the Posse Comitatus Act, there's nothing there. So I'm not real sure what they would be pulling out of their hat to try to make it illegal for him to do this. As of what I've seen, I think it's perfectly legal. Yes, the president can enact posses. He can send military around to enforce laws. The posses, which is basically what a posse was. I don't think he wants to. But I do think that he will use that power if he has to, if they force him into it. And right now, that's what they're doing. They're not giving in at all. So, let's see what happens. I think it's going to be an interesting January. So that's what I've got for you today, and I want to thank you for stopping by. Thank you for helping me hit 40,000. That was super cool. Did you hear me cheering? I'm sure wherever you were in the world, you heard me going, woohoo! So I want to thank you so much, and I hope that we'll head on to 50,000. That'd be the next goal. So thanks for stopping by, and I'll see y'all later.